Okay, can everybody hear me if I speak at this volume? Is that all right? Yes, more or less. Okay, so as I'm sure many of you might also have been, upon viewing the exhibit for the first time, I was struck by the amount of overt religious imagery that many of the works express. This is particularly the case for the works exhibited here by Chilean artists Las Yeguas del Apocalipsis and Elías Adasme. The former, for those of you who have yet to tour the galleries, Las Yeguas, whose name means mares of the apocalypse, mares being she-horse, by the way. Their work displays conquest, burial, and the Last Supper, while Adasme's work, which is the four large photographs on the left-hand side of the wall in the gallery behind me, evokes crucifixion, the suffering body of the martyr, and perhaps most obviously, salvation. One might wonder why this is the case. Undoubtedly, such imagery is an attempt to reclaim the dictatorship and its supporters' use of the same millenarian language. For example, one group of conservative religious leaders in Chile, shortly after the September 11th coup, argued that, quote, the pronouncement of the armed forces was the response from God to the prayers of all those believers who see in Marxism the same satanic force of darkness in its maximal expression, end quote. Indeed, Pinochet himself, while claiming to have never opened a Bible before entering the army as a young man, would occasionally claim himself that the military, in seizing power from, quote, godless Marxism, would carry out a divine mission and did so with a, quote, Christian inspiration. Nevertheless, while all of these artists exhibited here are undoubtedly operating in situations of political opposition, that opposition necessarily means they were forming their own unique visions of the futures of their societies. Upon deeper study of the opposition movement, particularly in Chile, one uncovers that these artists' deployment of religious imagery is perhaps not so strange after all. In fact, my research on the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile demonstrate that not only was the Catholic Church a crucial locus of political organization during the dictatorship, it was also a central animating force in the moral underpinnings of the opposition movement. Catholics, both lay and clergy, worked side by side with communists and socialists, and often explicitly ascribed to those political ideologies themselves. Moreover, the crucial text of the Catholic social teaching infused the opposition politics with a moral indignation in the face of not only the dictatorship's human rights abuses, but also its pursuit of a neoliberal capitalist paradigm. Before we get there, however, I would like to back up and provide a brief overview of the history of the Chilean path to socialism and the subsequent military dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet. Before we get there, however, I'd like to back up and provide a brief overview of the history of the Chilean path to socialism and the subsequent military dictatorship. While we could well start earlier, as the timeline behind me does, as good a place as any to begin is the run-up to Chile's 1970 presidential election, an election that would see socialist Salvador Allende elected. Allende's presidency, as it sought to operate within the context of the existing Chilean constitution, was hotly contested both from within Chile and from without. As any student for whom I have served as a TA in IEH and ISS course, and in fact some of them are here, hi guys, will know the United States has over the years had its fingers in many pies. Right-wing groups argued that in order to defend the, quote, Christian heritage of Western civilization, end quote, the advance of the political left had to be stopped. Throughout the campaign, the right argued that, like in Cuba, the election of Salvador Allende would result in the forced abandonment of religion, attacks on the church, and state-backed atheism. Despite these attacks, after the votes were tallied, Allende ended up with a plurality of votes. Following his confirmation, Salvador Allende would receive Cardinal Raul Silva, and that name will become important later, in his home. And during the 1,000 days of Allende's presidency, the relationship between the Catholic Church and Allende's Unidad Popular, or Popular Unity Coalition, was cordial and even friendly by all accounts. So from 1970 to 1973, Allende's government set about what was perhaps the most ambitious socialist project ever attempted. Not only would Popular Unity build socialism, but the coalition would do so through constitutional means, working through the confines of the existing political system. Land reform, rights to housing, nationalization of industries, price controls, and massive increases in wages all took place in this too brief period. On the other hand, sanctions, capital strikes, and right-wing mobilization increased the political polarization to crisis levels. Through explicit attempts to create a coup climate, The political right in the end succeeded in overthrowing Allende. Through this ferment and toil, Chile's experiment in a democratic path to socialism would come crashing to an end on September 11, 1973. On this day, the armed forces staged a coup d'etat that would see Allende deposed, and dying at his own hand later on, and significant human rights violations occurred in the subsequent months and years. While these human years of dictatorship come to defiance domestically, on the international stage, Chile became famous for its implementation of the first national program of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a notoriously slippery term to define, but in the case of the United States, it is a social and economic program, perhaps best encapsulated in what we would call Reaganomics or supply-side economics, which we can be a little bit more familiar with. The ideas of austerity, trickle-down tax policies, and liberalization of corporate and banking laws became, and unfortunately remain, in my opinion, the global status quo. Universally, both in Chile and the United States, neoliberalism has led to increased corporate earnings at the expense of the immiseration of the population. The nation-state ceased to be a provider of services like education and social welfare, and instead became a guarantor of corporate profits through a raiding and privatization of the commons. This process began in Chile and required the supposed divine violence of the dictatorship for its implementation. The Catholic Church was quick, however, in becoming a thorn in the military government side. The aforementioned Cardinal Silva set up a variety of organizations that documented the dictatorship's human rights abuses and provided social services. Moreover, it was through these organizations that the Catholic Church came out firmly against the military government's program of neoliberalism in a way that combined the class consciousness of the Allende years with the moral spirit of Catholic social teaching. Drawing in equal measure from Vatican encyclicals like Laborem Exercens and Marxism, large segments of the Catholic Church critiqued neoliberal policies on the grounds that they curtailed the potential of humanity, destroyed human solidarity, and violated the Catholic insistence on a preferential option for the poor. The impetus for this change was, according to Monsignor Enrique Alvear, that, quote, God manifests himself already in this world in which we live today, end quote, and thus the terrestrial realm was one worth fighting for. Towards the end of the dictatorship, however, the institutional structure of the church in Chile began to change. With Cardinal Silva's retirement in 1983, John Paul II's Vatican began to make substantial changes in Chile. At the prompting of Papal Nuncio, which a Papal Nuncio is sort of like a papal ambassador, if you will, Angelo Solano, a figure who later became Pope Benedict XVI Secretary of State, and someone you'll be familiar with if you follow the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandal, began to advocate for the appointment of more conservative bishops in Chile. In this way, the Catholic right, both lay and clergy that had long been on the fringes of the Church, once again returned to prominence. Organizations like Opus Dei and other right-wing groups that had long been represented in the government now had the backing of the Church's institutional powers. Thus, while Cardinal Silva's replacement, Archbishop Juan Francisco Fresno, played a key role in the transition to democracy in 1990, this transition would retain the dictatorship's constitution and retain the formal and legal aspects of neoliberalism. And if you've all been following the news, one of the demands of the Chilean protesters is, in fact, for a new constitution. They've had the same one since 1980. My future research seeks to examine the precise ways in which these right-wing Catholic groups within Chile rose to power and the role that they would play in the church at the end of the dictatorship. So I'd like to sort of argue for a couple of key takeaways here, because in the United States we're sort of familiar with political religiosity being a sort of reserve of the political far right. But in fact, the way we should look at it is that all political programs, regardless of their ideological positioning, require faith in some set of ideals. And that's all I have. So, yeah. Thank you all.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm not going to really get into the paper part of it, because if you want to read it, we can talk about it later. But again, my name is Kyle. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Teacher Education. And you may be wondering why a China scholar and a teacher educator is here with you in an exhibit about Latin America. And what I want to share with you today is the idea that the protest tactics and aesthetics are more global than it might seem. Sounds pretty simple, right? Not so easy. So I want to start our story in 1989. Berlin Wall falls 30 years ago, recently. China is going through a big change. 2,000 democracy activists are murdered in Tiananmen Square. They are part of a democratization movement that we thought after 1989 was stamped out. China had two responses to the Tiananmen Square massacre. The first is more visible, right? We know about the Great Firewall, internet censorship, and to put it in pretty frank terms, it is the largest project of human censorship to date. What's less visible is one of the more subtle and quiet things that the Chinese government did. It's called the Patriotic Education Campaign, and it was designed to, via curriculum, prevent another Tiananmen. And the Patriotic Education Campaign starts at the preschool level and goes until the end of high school. And what it's meant to do is literally create Chinese citizens in the way that the Chinese government wants them to be created. And so the idea was that if we can create a passive and compliant population that could produce and see the privilege and value in higher education, China itself would be more peaceful and it would be richer. And so you'd think that in this elite space that China's created, its universities, you'd think that there wouldn't be spaces for radicalism. But there are, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I found them. I did interviews with about 55 people over 3 months in China, and we talked a lot about what dissidence needs to look like. One respondent told me really clearly that there's this idea that the academy itself can be a radical space in China despite the censorship, that in academic research, substantive and thorough critiques of the Chinese government can still be made. But as one respondent told me, ordinary people cannot understand your research, and so it's very safe to the regime. But what does it mean when critical research can't get out of the university? And I think this student was as much critiquing our universities and universities around the world. It's not just a Chinese problem. It's about all of us. And so I asked him, how do you think, where's the radicalism in that? And why would you want to give up this position of power and privilege in the academy to do dissident work that'll have you, as one person said, black-bagged and tied up and sent away? And the answer was a really surprising one. This respondent told me that it's about seeing the radical potential in just hanging out. Hanging out. Why? Because hanging out, as far as these students were concerned, meant having underground gay-straight alliances, radical queer and trans spaces, conversations about democracy. And they told me that this idea that in protest, martyrdom was not the answer. The aesthetics of resistance needed to look different because China's technologies of violence are different. And so the methods that they laid out were about developing identity. And we think of identity in the US as kind of this divisive thing, right? Identity politics, right? But when identity is a unifying space, when identity can see an interpersonal connection with someone that is in an identity that is completely contrary to what the state wants you to be or how to act, that's the radicalism. And so what a respondent told me, she said that radicalism here exists below the surface, as it does in other societies, but it doesn't look like picket lines. It doesn't look like the conventional riot. It looks a little bit more like disseminating this like idea that you can be something else. You can be the other and do so in a way that is both safe and it's communal, that we together can do this. And so what they talked about was this idea that identity is unifying. So by trying to find other people and other places in which we can just be, and the act of being is an act of resistance. There is a radicalism in just existing contrary to how the state wants you to be. And so I think the lesson that I took away from China, and I think is relevant to our higher education institutions now, is this sense that radical dissidence can be subtle, and that subtle dissidence can be radical. That the practice of hanging out might not look like the resistance that we expect. It is being performed by bodies that do not look like ours in ways that do not look like ours. And what this is to say is that if hanging out can be radical, what else is also radical? And so the notion that I was playing with in this paper was that if just hanging out is radical, then we can see our intentional actions, the actions that we take, the choices that we make as individuals can be powerful and are powerful. And when the government, when states like China, like the US, demand that we perform, that we produce, that we consume, rinse and repeat, just the very act of surviving otherwise is radical. The idea being that the longer that we can persist despite what the state wants us to be and how it wants us to act, it deflates the necessity of martyrdom, because we need bodies to survive and persist. Because, I mean, to quote Bettina Love, we need to do more than just survive in education. It is about persisting and resisting in the ways of finding ourselves, the people who we think we want to be. And that, I think, is what makes China's dissidence so radical. What was really shocking, though, was how few people believed me in the US. I was really surprised when I presented this paper for the first time. They said, well, you need to show resistance. You need to embody it. You need to live it. How are these kids not living it? When being gay in China is a crime. When calling the mass incarceration of Uyghurs anything but the use of concentration camps and mass detention. How is that not radical? How is that not radical to see the potential in just being and persisting and surviving? And so the lesson I took back from from the people who gave me interviews was this phrase in Chinese. It's 革命到底, which means a lifetime commitment to revolution. Having a lifetime commitment to revolution means that you still have to be alive by the end of the resistance. And so as we consider the ways in which we diversify our actions, diversify our resistance, we can see the potential not just to resist, but to persist and survive. And I think at the end of the day, that is the radical practice of hanging out. So, thank you.
Jane. I got a question for Kyle. When
Yeah.
you're talking about hanging out,
Yeah.
that immediately makes me think of, when I was in high school and college, of finding like-minded people and jamming with bands.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Are they doing it in an underground kind of way, or are they doing it in public settings? Are they going to coffee houses, or are they going into we had basements?
Yeah.
What's their?
Yeah. Well, I think the students I talked to, so they were from two parts of China. So about half of them were from Beijing and half of them were from southeastern China. And you could see there's like the metropolitan space, like the city itself, enables different technologies, high and low, of creating those spaces. So one person in particular comes to mind who was trying to talk about, to do lecturing on non-binary pronoun usage, right? And this was part of his Queer Alliance work at Beijing Normal University. And he told me, you know, I asked him, I was like, how do you even make space for this? If you have consistent people, you can't use WeChat, which is the chat app that most Chinese folks use, right? Because the government is monitoring it for subversive language. So how do you do it? And he said, he's like, you know, it's Post-it notes. It's paper, it's pen on paper, it's low tech, it's all of the things that you would imagine would be like 60 years ago of how we spread things, you know, no hashtags, no instant messaging. And some people also just they would run into people on the street and would say, have you ever thought about learning more about your sexuality or gender identity? And people would be like, oh, no way. And I followed it, I walked it with him for a few days, and he really had it down. There's like a routine, there's like a way to do it now. And he would always come up to people and he would say, you know, can we talk? And it would always seem so urgent, but it was so fun. Like those meetings, they would just watch, films from the American LGBT rights movement, you know, and it would just be, it's such a fun and positive space. And I think that was what allowed people to keep coming back, was that affirming, the affirming nature of the space they created.
I actually have a related question for Patrick. Kyle, you reminded me that one of the things that's really important about dissident movements is the ways that dissident voices move through the space. I think we're experiencing that here in the gallery. There's a lot of dissonant voice in the exhibition itself, and it's supposed to speak loudly to us. I'm curious about, Patrick, if you could tell us more about sort of the underground way that the Catholic Church was moving and supporting dissident messages.
Sure. So it should be said that like the Catholic Church, through a lot of Latin America, a lot of Europe as well, has a degree of political cover that made their being the vehicle for the dissident movement possible in the first place. But one of the things that it sort of enabled them to do is there's a really massive clandestine press, right? So, you know, it's one of the things I'm sort of working through at the moment, because whenever you go to the archive abroad, you kind of have to do the archive shuffle where you take like thousands of pictures and then you come back and work through them. But there's this really massive clandestine press that's you know, sort of, again, with the political cover of the Catholic Church, that has strangely sort of all sorts of people working inside of it. So people who aren't even Catholic, who are, you know, who are committed atheists, who are Marxists, right? They're all sort of using that space to publish. So, yeah.
If there are no other questions for the group today, we'll adjourn. Thank you so much for attending. This is the first of a series I hope we do more often in the galleries. We love featuring graduate students here at the Broad Museum. Their knowledge and expertise is fantastic. So thank you, Kyle and Patrick.
Yeah. Oh, thanks.